Viewers. My name is Kitty Fodor, and I will speak about the global and historical justice dimensions of the European Green Deal, launched by the European Union in 2019. The aim of this video is to provide perspective on how the Green Deal is affecting developing countries, as it deems itself a leader in green and renewable transformation, but its global context is rarely discussed, especially with regard to the poorest half of the world. In this video, I would like to explain elements of the Green Deal which may or may not increase global inequalities. In order to dwell deeper into this topic, it's important to first look at some key concepts that will be mentioned during the video. Firstly, what is the European Green Deal? The European Green Deal is a package of policy initiatives which aims to set the EU on the path of green transition with the ultimate goal of reaching climate neutrality by 2050, but with an introspective focus. You can learn more about it by clicking on the title on this slide. Secondly, I would like to show whether the Green Deal contributes more to climate justice or climate colonialism, thus these will also be important concepts. Climate justice, according to the definition of Equinox, covers the concerns about the inequitable outcomes for different peoples and places associated with the vulnerability to climate impacts and the fairness of policy and practice responses to address climate change and its consequences. Climate justice is a very particular issue of our days with several layers of historical contributors. That is why it can refer to different types of climate impact-related inequalities, such as those between the global north and south, between the rich and the poor, between races and genders, and alternatively, it has an intra-country, an international, and an intergenerational interpretation. The core point of it, however, is that climate justice always aims to provide justice and compensation for those who have contributed least to climate change, but who are disproportionately greatly affected by its negative consequences. On the other hand, climate colonialism can be defined as a structural practice where countries in the global north exploit and overpower countries in the global south to increase their power and control of less powerful countries under the guise of reducing global carbon emissions and building green technology. For instance, by extracting raw materials from developing countries with highly polluting local conditions to later use the materials for sustainable infrastructure. Now, let's take a look at the extent to which the Green Deal provides climate justice. Climate justice can be viewed through numerous lenses, driven by political ideas, for instance, a racial or feminist approach, or based on geography from global to local scale, or from a historical perspective. In this section, I will briefly present 3+1 important viewpoints. Firstly, we can see this debate as an interspecies inequality where humans dominate access and exploitation of resources and consumption of atmospheric space in a most disproportionate manner. In this regard, the Green Deal provides substantially improved policies, especially with the programs of Fit for 55 and Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. Nevertheless, it falls short on indirect emissions, for instance by its high rates of meat imports, and thus its significant contribution to deforestation worldwide. According to Statista, Europe accounts for the fourth largest share of meat consumption, a robust 7.7 million metric tons of beef annually. Yet, what we can see as a strategy inside the Green Deal can be considered as a significant step towards the recovery of justice provision vis-à-vis species. Secondly, the most common view of injustice is an international, global perspective in which rich nations historically and currently consume a disproportionate amount of atmospheric space with their carbon emissions, and they also exacerbate negative climate impacts in more vulnerable parts of the world. This vulnerability can be seen from a climate point of view. For instance, coastal communities or areas prone to desertification are more affected, but there are also societal and economic factors, such as the economic dependency on the fossil industry. In certain countries, which is necessary to sustain the more sophisticated and capital-intensive industry of the global north. This is the part where the question of climate colonialism fits the most, so let's look at the EU's policies. In this regard, the Green Deal is often heavily criticized for greenwashing its image, backed by its lack of agenda on the topic, partly because of its self-advertisement as a global climate leader, to which the EGD is the main legitimizing source, but also because of its historical contribution to the natural exploitation of the least developed countries. What it lacks is putting global equality on the agenda and the recognition of historical responsibility. There have been emerging concerns of carbon leakage as a result of the new policies. For this purpose, the EU has been negotiating the implementation of a carbon border adjustment mechanism that would counter such risks by equalizing global carbon pricing of imported and domestic products of the most carbon-intensive sectors. In the next slide, we can see that the most impacted countries are not necessarily among the poorest ones. However, it does not make any distinction towards less developed exporters. Thus, the policy substantially raises the trade barriers for least developed countries, also breaking one of the most important principles of climate justice, reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement, the common but differentiated responsibilities. Therefore, we can say that this mechanism would also economically penalize countries that are the least responsible for the climate crisis, but the most economically affected by it. However, the EU is minimizing its future carbon footprint on the most vulnerable countries by its ambitious goals on the reduction of carbon emissions, as well as its climate neutrality objectives by 2030 and 2050 respectively. We can see that the EU's commitment to reducing its emissions is truly impressive and implemented. However, considering the consumption-based emissions, which include carbon leakages, its relative position compared to lower-income countries is still high, although decreasing. Here we can see the relative position of the EU compared to lower-income countries and more developed ones as well. The third layer is international climate justice, which takes into account most of the social costs of climate impacts and depending on the interpretation of climate transition too. Even though the European continent is not especially climate vulnerable, there are still less resilient groups who face difficulties due to environmental effects, to which the Social Climate Fund is a useful counterbalancing instrument supporting the most vulnerable households, especially those impacted by ETS2. On the other hand, the Just Transition Mechanism aims exactly to reduce the costs of green transition on socio-economic groups who are vulnerable to the effects of a systemic change, such as those in mining and fossil-based industries. One criticism by the academia is that it isn't specific enough, and by not identifying which groups it will protect, it cannot be ultimately inclusive. If the EU can keep its promises, however, the EU will become a forerunner in the reduction of social footprint of climate policies. Lastly, we must look beyond mere geographical inequalities, therefore the intergenerational dimension of climate injustices cannot be ignored either. Europe lacks a narrative of acknowledging its historical responsibility in global emissions. However, it involves very forward-looking initiatives involved, and without the chance to compare it to other policies worldwide, it is difficult to define its impact for future generations. The aim of this video is not to judge whether the EGD is a just or colonialist vision, but to provide a perspective on both sides of the coin, how it helps and what it excludes, in order to raise awareness on unresolved challenges and potential policy developments. In the last couple of minutes, we could see how the EU exhibits an unprecedented effort to leave no one behind, and how it shows solidarity with the Just Transition Mechanism, and yet it misses the larger scale and the systemic consequences of its policies. Even though The EU is oftentimes criticized for greenwashing itself and providing a hypocritical image of sustainable leadership. We must acknowledge that we cannot expect one entity in a system to change and solve all inequalities, as well as the fact that the Green Deal is intended to be primarily an introspective policy framework. In the next slides, you can see the sources that I've used to conduct this research and do this video, and I hope that it was very useful for all the viewers. Thank you very much for your attention.